Hey everyone and welcome. We're in my wormery and I was picking through my freezer and I found this container full of frozen something. I wasn't quite sure what it was. And it had kind of a familiar smell to it, but I still couldn't figure out what it was. So once I started picking down into it, I did find a fragment of the of what it originally was. And this is the stem of a banana. So it would appear that I, at one point, had taken some banana peels and ground them up into kind of a nice fine mush, and I threw them into the freezer. Must have been a good year and a half ago now. But it seems high time to make use of this, and it seemed like it might be a good food to place down into my nightcrawler bins. The nightcrawlers are in those two pink pots. It's been about 12 days since I last fed those. And it was only 3 days ago that we checked in on them and there were still some scraps from the previous feeding, but I figured, you know what, I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to give that existing food supply that's in those containers a little bit of a backup. And then it'll also let me get rid of this very old frozen banana peel material that's been ground up really fine, so the worms should love it once it starts to thaw out. And then in my other bins, I've got some other food scraps here. These are actually the food scraps that didn't get consumed last time we fed, and there's another container full of coffee grinds. The main goal here is going to be to replenish the food supply and the horizontal migrations that are going on in those bins up there. It's been 6 days, but I figured I'd put a little bit more food in there to kind of help keep the movement of those horizontal migrations happening. And this bin down here, it's my newest bin. It's only about 10 days old now, but it got fed 3 days ago. It doesn't need more food, but what it's getting today is more worms. And the source of those worms is going to be the worms that have been moving into the horizontal migration in this bin right here. This bin has now been in the horizontal migration mode for 40 days. And I did take a poke around within the finished compost material a few minutes ago, and I found that there were very few, if any, worms in there at all. So the time has come. I'm bringing that bin to a close today. The worms that come out are going to go right into my newest bin to beef up the head count, population head count, whatever you want to refer to it as. And the castings are going to come out, and they're going to go into one of my storage buckets. So I'm going to go ahead and start with the night crawlers, bring them up here onto the tabletop, and we're going to give them those hacked up banana peels to start, and then we'll continue with the rest of the work afterwards. So now I went ahead and I hacked off a couple nice sized chunks of that frozen banana peel, ground up frozen banana peels. And we're going to start with the African night crawlers. The African night crawlers are over here in this container. So like we've been doing in the past, I've been trying to preserve these leaves that are on top for cover so that we could tend to the needs of the bin and then simply drop those leaves right back in on top. So I'm going to stick to doing that. Now, it's only a few days now since we last tended to these bins, and basically all I did was drop in a little bit more bedding material into these bins because they seemed a little bit damp. So I took a bunch of hacked up cardboard and dropped them down into these feeding zones, and then I just took all of the existing cantaloupe rind and placed it all back down there right into the feeding zone, which is pretty much down the middle in this case. If I can snatch a couple pieces of this cardboard and bring it up top, then I will, because then we could try to use some of this to cover up with after we've plopped in our little banana peel, shredded banana peel mixture. But I just want to have a little bit that I can sprinkle on top after we've added this banana peel. So this hunk of banana peel is pretty good size. It's a nice fat chunk, so it should thaw out pretty quickly. It's actually kind of brittle. I was able to shatter it pretty easily to break that chunk off. So I'm going to see if I can just bring in some of this material from the side and then take these cardboard shreds that we moved up from below to pile it over the top, because I don't want it to be too appealing to the little flying insects. Here and there you could see a gnat or a fruit fly or something buzzing around, and they're probably sensing the food stuff that's in these bins, so they're coming down to check it out. So I don't want it to be too easy for them to get at it, and that's the other reason for all this leaf cover on top as well. So yeah, we're not really doing a lot of worm spotting here with these bins, because that does require sort of excavating them up from the lower reaches of the bin. So I'm not really after that here. For these African night crawlers and the European night crawlers, I'm just interested in getting a little bit more food in here to supplement the old food that's in here, and then we'll move on. So this bin got pretty much the same treatment. Both bins got the same treatment 3 days ago. It was just a little bit more bedding, dropped down into the lower reaches of the feeding area. So here too, I'm just going to try to salvage a few pieces of that cardboard scrap that was placed in here a couple days ago, just so I can use it to cover up the banana peel, shredded banana peel, after I plop it in here. So this bin has more worms in it because it started out with a population of 500 as opposed to the African night crawlers, which started out with only a population of 100. So that's why I tend to try to put a little bit extra food into this bin when I feed, and I believe for that purpose I'm probably also going to supplement the leaves that I scraped off the top. So I'll return these leaves to cover up the food, but I'm also going to go right to my box here and throw in a little bit more fresh leaf material. Looks like I just tapped myself out. Thought I had more in that box, but that must have been the end of it. That's fine though, that should be enough. Okay, so there we go. Night crawlers have now been fed after 12 days. Hopefully they enjoy the banana feast. And we'll continue checking in on them as time progresses. But let's get them back up on the shelf and we'll move on to the next feeding. Alright, so these next feedings are intended to be more like supplemental type feedings, because it's only been about 6 days since they last got food, but I just want to make sure that the horizontal migration in these bins is spurred on as best as I can see to it. So I just want to make sure that if the feeding zone in these bins is starting to look a little bit depleted, then I go ahead and I give them a little bit more. So I'm going to try to do the same thing here, just preserve some of this leaf cover by removing it temporarily as we take care of the feeding, but no signs of the food that they might have been given last time 6 days ago. I'm trying to remember what it was, and I just don't remember what it was, but anywhere I begin digging down, I just see a huge mass of worms. So whatever it was that they got fed last time, it looks like the majority of it has probably been depleted. So this is a good timely feeding, I believe. I guess you know what I'm going to do is I'm going to try to encourage the worms to make their way all the way across the food that's already partially composted, and put all the newly added fresh food that they get all the way out on the outer edge. Got a piece of watermelon, piece of broccoli, a hunk of shredded veggies, assorted shredded veggies, and then we're going to go ahead and we're going to use up whatever remains of this shredded banana peel, but we'll save some for the other bin that's getting the same treatment. So this looks like a pretty nice, healthy feeding over here on the very far edge. I'm going to top it off with some coffee grinds, because I think that the coffee grinds have a good kind of neutral smell to them. Nothing too sweet to attract all kinds of flying pests and stuff. So I think that's a good way to top off the food if you've got stuff like banana peels and watermelon. Hopefully it's, you know, such that it doesn't allow for the really sweet smell of it to attract all kinds of unwanted pests. Okay, so I guess I'm just curious, as long as we're in here, before we go ahead and cover things up, just wondering how the depopulation of this material is progressing. Because it's only been 2 weeks now since we set up this horizontal migration in this bin. And 2 weeks is, you know, granted, it's a fair amount of time for things to progress. And we've supplemented the food over here a couple times now too. So I would say, compared to what we just observed in the feeding zone in terms of all those worms we observed over there, I guess what we're seeing over here within the nearly finished compost is not much at all. So I guess the horizontal migration is doing a pretty good job of getting the worms out of the finished compost and rounded up into a spot where they can be plucked out and relocated. But I'm not going to be relocating any of these worms today. We're going to relocate some out of that old bin that's being harvested today. And we're just going to allow these worms to continue to congregate over in one end of the bin for a while before we start thinking about a new home for them. I guess that's the other thing, is I don't really have a new home for them set up yet. I've already got something in mind for that, but I'm not quite ready to make that happen, at least not yet. So for now, we're just going to continue with the ongoing horizontal migration here. And so far it's day 14 on this horizontal migration. I think it's coming along great. All right, let's get the next bin out here. Okay, so now this bin and the bin that we just worked on, both the same exact age, have both been managed identically during their entire lifespans. So as you could probably guess, this horizontal migration is also now at day 14, just like the last bin we looked at. So we would probably expect to see fairly similar results in here. Okay, so despite being managed in identical ways from the beginning, it's not a guarantee that the two bins are going to be at the same stage necessarily. So hopefully we're not going to see too many worms down here within the compost. So why don't we do that? Why don't we take a quick inspection of how the depopulation of the material is progressing. And you know, just from an initial glance, I would almost have to say that this material has more worms in it, just from the first couple scoops. So let's see what's all the way over here on the far end. Here too, it seems like more worms than we saw in the last bin. So I would have to say that there's probably a pretty good chance that the other bin is going to make it to the finish line sooner than this one in terms of the finished compost being depopulated. Because there are a number of worms throughout it, and not only that, but the material is seems to be a little bit more damp than the material we just saw in the last bin, which is the same exact age. And the moisture level, you know, the higher moisture level within this bin could also be part of the reason that the worms are preferring to stay in this material, and they probably won't be inspired to move out until such a time that the material starts to dry off a bit more. So that's part of the reason I've been keeping these very lightly covered with just a single sheet of paper. And it's also the reason I'm kind of airing it out right now and trying to get some air pockets down into the material by agitating it a little this way, so that hopefully it'll help it air out a little bit and dry off. Nevertheless, I'm assuming we're going to find the feeding zone in a similar state as we saw in the other bin, which is tons and tons of worms, which is exactly what we're seeing here. As we start to push it aside, let's just look at it from this side too. Yeah, this feeding zone is very, very busy here. And you know, it almost makes me wonder if it could be that maybe there's just no more room in here for more worms. Maybe these guys tried to come over and they said, sorry, full house, come back later. So nevertheless, I'm going to stick to my guns and try to maintain a consistent approach to dealing with both bins. So I'm going to do the exact same thing we just did to the previous bin, which is supplement the feeding, do it on the very, very outer edge, and then cover up and let it continue. All right. So same as before, we're going to use up this hacked up banana peel. You can see it's falling apart already. It's not terribly rigid, despite having been frozen for the past 1.5 years or so. Whatever I have remaining in this bag is also going to go in here, I suppose. It's another piece of banana, another piece of melon. I guess in this case it's going to be 2 pieces of melon. And other varied small scraps of vegetable. Piece of cucumber. It should make for a very appealing place for the worms to come hang out in, rather than over in the old boring compost that they're in now. Although I believe it will be time pretty soon to start setting up a new habitat for these worms. Because I think it does help to be able to depopulate the feeding zone at one point, reestablish it, and allow the worms to continue their migration out of the finished compost in multiple waves. Looking good over here. Let's go ahead and restore the leaf cover that we extracted from the feeding zone earlier. All right, very nice. Like to see good progress in the horizontal migrations when it's happening, and I've been fortunate to see pretty good results in the last few tries. Okay, so the last thing to do today is to bring closure to this oldest of my bins by simply scooping out all of the finished compost and then relocating the worms from the feeding zone. So I'm going to leave the worms here for now, and I'm going to grab my storage bucket, which already has some castings in it from the last time I harvested. But I'm hoping that I've got adequate space in it to store the compost that comes out of this bin here. So I'm going to just start scooping it out and placing it into the container. Since there's no worms in here for the most part, I don't think there's a great deal of harm in using a metal tool, although in the past I've gotten numerous people commenting about the use of metal tools in my vermicomposting, so I've done my best to not use them. But in this case, I think we're safe, since there are so few worms remaining in this material. Now, as you see, a worm here or there. I guess we'll do our best to try to keep them with the rest of their buddies and keep them separate from the finished compost. However, I'm not too concerned about bringing worms over into the finished compost, because in reality I'm guessing that there's probably going to be a fair number of cocoons in this material anyway, meaning there's probably going to be baby worms hatching out in here anyhow. So it doesn't matter. I think it's just part of the worm life cycle to manage their populations based on available food, and if there's still worms in here, I believe they're going to recognize the fact that there's not a whole lot of food remaining for them to feed on, so they'll limit their reproduction and just utilize whatever remains to sustain themselves as long as possible. I guess I'm going to try to stand this container up and hopefully create enough space on top so that I can scoop out the remainder of this and store all of it in here. Okay, so I believe I've pretty much hit the limit of my storage container. I'm almost up to the very rim here. I guess that's fine because since I don't have much more space to store anymore, it does look like I've managed to extract all of the castings from this container with the exception of a little bit that remains. So I'm going to go ahead and move this aside. So now we'll move these little guys over and go grab their new home. Wow, this bin feels so light compared to the the weight of a pretty much finished bin. Alright, so moving the camera back should give us a better view of what's happening here. It does look like some flying insects have discovered this bin because they're swarming around here. Not too many, but still might require a little bit more leaf cover just to prevent that from happening. But I'll tend to that at a later time. All we need to do now is launch off the worms. So let's remove the paper cover here and this piece of cardboard that we were using as the divider to separate the feeding zone from the finished compost. We can use this as bedding, I guess, in this bin here. So let's go ahead and create a little space in here where we can introduce the worms to and still have some material here that we could use to cover up with. I'll push this stuff off to the side. Very much time's elapsed since we last fed this bin, but I don't really see much food in here. I guess we'll get the new worms added, and at some point in the near future I'll have to return into this bin and make sure I supplement their food supply. Yeah, this is that piece of paper towel that had lettuce wrapped up in it. I don't see any signs of the lettuce remaining here. Here it looks like we've got some scraps of leftover watermelon rind here and there, but certainly not much to speak of. Just a paper thin green skin. So yeah, this bin is definitely going to be ready for a little bit more food, especially with the additional newly added worms going in. But I just want to get these little guys out of their old container and into their new home. So I'm going to also see if I could salvage some of these old leaves that are over here to cover up with after the fact. So let's scoop these off too. These might come in useful after we relocate the worms. And I guess I'm not going to do anything too fancy in this migration. I'm just thinking I might just turn this one upside down and start pouring the worms out. So let's do it that way. Try to do it one handful at a time so it happens in a manageable way. We have already extracted worms from this nearly finished container a couple times before, or at least one other time prior. So this would just be the balance of the worms that were still remaining behind. So I'm not quite sure how many to expect in here. It does look like there's a fair number. Yep. The horizontal migration appears to have done its job here as well. This material is a little bit more dry, maybe off the top. Not as many worms in it. Same with this stuff here. This stuff looks like it came from the bottom, so I think it should have some more worms in it. Yep, there we go. Interesting variety. Here we've got some pretty good sized ones compared to some very tiny ones scattered throughout. Different generations of worms. So at this point I think we might be able to just pour out what remains. And check out how those look. Okay. So I would venture to estimate that we might have just more or less doubled the population within this bin. So at this point I'm just going to see if I can ensure that I've extracted all of them so as not to leave any behind, even if they're little tiny ones that are hard to see. Yeah, you know, there's going to be a few remaining little worms stuck to the vermicompost that I couldn't scrape out. So I might just rinse this out outside with the garden hose, and then any worms that get dislodged as part of that cleaning will simply be free to roam outside. Okay, well, looks like I only got a little bit of vermicompost on my shirt over here, so I guess this is going to go into the hamper. But I guess that pretty much brings today's work to a close. So I'll clean up what's going on down here. There's not much remaining. It's just a little bit of tidying up, getting these things back on the shelf, washing a couple things. But that's kind of boring, so I won't take your time up with that. I'll just go ahead and bid you farewell for now, and thanks for watching. I appreciate your company. Hey, consider giving me a thumbs up. I always appreciate that. Any little bit of support is always really good for the channel, and also consider subscribing to the channel if you enjoy this sort of material. There's always more stuff on the way coming up soon, and if you hit the bell, you might get notification letting you know that it was just released, and you can check it out when it's new. Alright, thanks for watching everyone. Have a great day. Bye now.